Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be trying something a little bit different. Today we're going to be going through the Ministry back catalog from worst to best. Al Jourgensen has had a really prolific career creating music with various bands under many different monikers. Bands like Revolting Cocks, Lard, Buck Satan and the 666 Shooters, PTP, Palehead, 1000 Homo DJs, Surgical Meth Machine, Acid Horse, and the list goes on. But for this video, we're just going to focus in on Ministry, his main project. On top of the staggering amount of projects that Al has been involved with over the years, Ministry itself has had a really spastic history with roots in synth pop, shifting from that to early industrial into industrial metal, sludge metal, speed metal, you name an alternative genre, and Ministry has probably had a moment where it's touched on it. So today, in order of personal opinion of quality of these albums, I present to you Ministry's studio albums from worst to best. So to start things off, the worst Ministry record is 2003's Animositas Samana, and I know you may have been expecting something else, but we'll get to that. This album came at a time where Al Jourgensen really seemed finished with the band. This is the last release with Paul Barker on bass. Al Jourgensen had just lost a toe due to an infection from a hypodermic needle that had gotten lodged in his boot. This is a very deeply rough part of Ministry's history. In terms of the album's songwriting, past the first track, Animosity, a track which I actually do quite like, there's not really much to offer. Tracks like Unsung, Piss, Impossible, all of these songs are very forgettable, and the production on this album is really lacking any kind of polish. The sound of this album I can really only describe as awful and baffling. And as for that first track, Animosity, that's really the only song that has any merit, and even then it's still a very rough cut because of the album's entirely blown out production. Anyway, moving on, next up is 2018's Americant. I don't feel I need to say too much on this record, but here's my general thoughts. I like this album's return to a more sludge-heavy sound that's reminiscent of Filth Pig. The addition of DJ Swamp to the album is also a really great move. He does some pretty good work on this album despite its flaws. And as for the flaws, well, there's a bit of a story that I need to tell first that leads up to so many poor writing and sampling choices. Obviously, Jourgensen intended to retire Ministry as a whole after the death of Mike Scacia in 2012, so you get this gap in releases from Jourgensen until 2016 when he puts out the debut Surgical Meth Machine album with his producer, Sammy D'Ambrosio. An album that I thought was a little bit bottom-heavy, but was regardless one of the better releases from Al Jourgensen in quite a while, but this is a band that you can't really do a big tour with. It's just too small of an act. So, Jourgensen gets Ministry back together to tour some of the material off of From Beer to Eternity and the new Surgical Meth Machine album, which would close off the set each night. This was the 2017 co-headlining tour with Death Grips. So with that run, and the election of former President Donald Trump, and Al Jourgensen's history of politically charged music, this created a storm for Ministry to put out a new album. And I have a side note. This is a point that I can't prove, but I swear this happened. I ran into Jello Biafra in a record store in early 2016, and I got to talking with him about Lard, and I asked, hey, do you think Ministry will ever get back together? And he responded with, well, whenever Al runs out of money again, and kind of trailed off his thought. Anyway, we've got all of these elements coming together. Ministry drops this new album, and man, it's a stinker. First off, I'm not a Trump guy, but Donald Trump is a particularly bad source for samples, at least with the earlier Ministry albums where they were heavily sampling George Bush Sr. or Jr. They threw some somewhat cool effects over the samples, or at the very least used some kind of sinister sounding lines. And the issue is that Donald Trump really just does not provide nearly the same effect for sample work, and I can maybe stretch it to it being like intentional because it's supposed to point out the absurdity of what's being said, but that seems a little bit generous. As for good tracks on the album, Wargasm is at least a little bit better than some of the other tracks, and the last track, America, is pretty okay and even decent at parts, but Al Jourgensen is doing this weird guttural, low vocal delivery all over the album that he picked up on Relapse, and it's frankly just really bad. From the beginning of the album to the end, this whole album is just littered with bad samples, bad vocal work, bad lyrics, and some instrumentals which I find pretty lacking in general quality. Okay, so moving on. Next up is 2012's Relapse. This is the first album released after the first attempt Al Jourgensen made at dissolving Ministry. Like I said, this album introduced a really obnoxious vocal delivery into Al Jourgensen's go-to sound. And he does still do some of like the mid-2000s stuff, but for the life of me, I can't figure out why Al thought this was a good sound in the first place. This album also features a few songs written by Al Jourgensen's ex-wife Angelina, none of which are any good. Though this album has some pretty rough moments, there is still clearly some ideas floating floating around that usually end up being fumbled by awkward change-ups, but even still, Mike Scacia delivers some pretty tight playing on this album that's really good. Most of the album's highlights are the guitar work. As for the better tracks here though, the first song, Ghoul Diggers, has kind of a few cool moments, but really kind of just trips over its very bloated intro and continued spoken word parts. Also, the title track for the album, Relapse, has a pretty fun chorus. Jurgensen's vocals are again very weak, but this is a better cut. Weekend Warrior is also a fun track, but for what I'm sure is kind of unintentional reasons, it's just a really goofy track, but you know, it's fun. Up next is 2013's From Beer to Eternity. This is the final album to feature Mike Scacia, and that of course means that this was meant to be the final Ministry album. An album that at the very least improved upon the last record, Relapse, but which didn't end up fixing too many of its problems. Instead, it seems like this album was trying to just change things up enough so that the glaring issues that this album has wouldn't be as noticeable. At the very least, this album does offer more decent tracks, and a song that I consider one of the best in the later era Ministry catalog here, Change of Luck. From Beer to Eternity does start off a bit silly with Hail to His Majesty, which does have kind of a fun concept when you picture it being used in a live setting, but it's a one-trick pony and ends up going on like way too long. I mean, the track is 5 minutes of telling people off in a really desperate, attention-seeking way. It's really not a good look. Punch in the Face at least improves the pacing a little bit, but all Al is kind of doing is a blend between these like Relapse vocals and kind of the vocals off of Animosity. It's a really odd pairing, but at least he changes things up. I'd say one of the worst things about this era of Ministry, the 2010s as a whole, is particularly bad sampling, which is littered all over this album. It makes the songs that would be good seem like they weren't well thought out at all. Next up is 2021's Moral Hygiene. I did do a review of this album when it came out last year. My thoughts on it have remained largely unchanged, but with that being said, this is not one of Ministry's better offerings, but it does have at least a few tracks which I would say are actually pretty good. Notably the track Sabotage is Sex, which features Jello Biafra on vocals, which makes the track feel a lot more like a lard track, which makes the song easily the best on the album. The other track which I find particularly good is the cover of the Stooges' Search and Destroy. I feel like a lot of people panned this song, but honestly, the bass track is such a well-written track, it's kind of a no-brainer, and there is really no way for them to fuck this one up. And lo and behold, it's a pretty solid track. I do like the slowed-down guitar solos, I love Paul Diamore's bass playing, it's a great track. Aside from those two highlights, I admittedly don't have much else that's good to say about this album. I guess Alert Level is kind of a cool intro track, but again, this track pulls from a really bad sample library. Next up, we've got 1999's Dark Side of the Spoon. I think we're starting to round the corner into the good albums at this point, though I still really wouldn't describe this album as good, but it does have a couple of really great tracks, one of which is one of the best songs that Ministry has ever put out with Bad Blood. Bad Blood specifically elevates this album so much. That track just rips, and despite the inconsistency in the rest of this album, that song absolutely shines. I do also really like the opening track, Supermanic Soul, which I wish was more indicative of the rest of the songs on the album, but this and Bad Blood are pretty much the peak. At worst, every other track is just very forgettable. The next album is 2007's The Last Sucker. This album is a really great mid-2000s album for Ministry. I do find myself enjoying the remix album of this record, The Last Dubber, a little bit more, but the basis for all of these tracks is pretty solid on this album. The opening track, Let's Go, is so good, and the album really keeps its momentum going well into the first half of the album. Watch Yourself has a bit of a rough intro, but it's a cool track. Life is Good is a chug-heavy song, but it still has a really cool chorus. Really, this album feels like Ministry blowing through the last of their pretty good ideas, which is ever apparent as, like I said earlier, the superior version of this album is the remix album, The Last Dubber, which if you're not too hot on this album, I highly recommend you check that one out. I'm not including the remix albums on this list, but if I did, that one would easily be towards the top. Next up is 1996's Filth Pig. After the commercial success of 1992's Psalm 69, this album did as much of a 180 as possible in comparison to that record. Gone were the elaborate samples and synth work, and instead we got this sludge-heavy record with a title track that sounds like the audio equivalent to a Toxic Haze. And I like this record. I like it a lot. I think it's really outside of the box for Ministry, and even with the more modern attempts to capture some of the sound of this album, there's just no possible way to capture the amount of absolute desperate hatred and self-loathing that this album embodies. And while it may not be an artistic masterpiece, it absolutely is an emotional one. I mean, God, Al is just falling apart here. I love the title track, I love Lava, I love Crumbs, I love The Fall, I love the cover of Lay Lady Lay. This whole album is just such a weird turning point for these guys, and it feels kind kind of like watching a car crash in slow motion, but at the very least, these songs, despite how different they are, despite how barren a lot of the tracks feel, they are really, really brimming with character. So what's next? With Sympathy. This is, of course, Ministry's 1983 debut synth-pop album. Say what you will, but this album has a really awesome A-side. I did a review of this one at one point as well, but really the gist of it is that the first track, Effigy, through Work for Love, are an absolute gauntlet of some of the best synth-pop tracks ever made. Past that point, though, this album does nosedive quite a bit. The B-side isn't really awful, but the album came out when the B-side really was utilized for filler, and this album is a prime example. Here We Go is bland, What He Say is needlessly stupid, Say You're Sorry is kind of okay, but it's tapping a sound that Rick Astley did better, and Should Have Known Better and She's Got a Cause are so forgettable that I actually cannot remember what either track sounds like. Moving on, you got 2004's Houses of the Mole. This album has a similar issue to With Sympathy, as the top of this album hits much harder than the bottom half, but despite that, this album really breathed new life into Ministry, and the first 5 songs on this record are top-notch. And it's a shame that this whole top-heavy track listing thing is so prevalent for so many of these albums, because the gap that many of these records have between their classic counterparts is really wide, like miles apart. Though we are closing the gap more and more with each one of these releases, so on to the next one. 2006's Rio Grande Blood. This is the most solid album of their 2000s period. There's only like 2 or 3 tracks that fall short for me, and they're not really that bad. They are on the B-side though, predictably. Rio Grande Blood is one of the most vicious songs in the entire Ministry catalog. It's a Slayer song on steroids. It's speed metal to its logical conclusion, but even still, the sonic beatdown does not stop there. Senior Peligro drops a train on this track listing. Gangrene is a further beatdown. Fear is Big Business has the best build on the album into one of the highest tempo tracks Ministry has ever put out. Lies, Lies, Lies and The Great Satan were Rock Band downloadable content. And I say that as a joke, but how wild is it that these songs were available as DLC for Rock Band? I mean, they're great tracks, but it's kind of a weird thing to think about. Palestina and Khyber Pass are both incredible tracks as well, with the latter being one of my favorite Ministry songs. Also, if you haven't checked it out, you should listen to the 2011 version off of the Ministry and Co-Conspirators cover album Undercover. Both versions rock, but that version, man, it's tight. Up next is 1986's Twitch, the sophomore release from Ministry. This is the first time Al really starts delving into that raw proto-industrial sound. I would argue that all industrial has its roots in synth-pop, partially as a result of this record, because the whole record is still toying with those ideas, albeit it is moving away from that with its creative blending of post-punk and gothic elements. Just Like You is a great mood setter and a really cool way to introduce this new sound we believe starts hitting a really forward-thinking wave in these repetitive beats that most of the industrial genre would continue to revolve around for years. All Day takes more of that sound and blends it again with that early synth-pop style. That single really rips too. This is one of the best early Ministry tracks. The Angel almost ends up feeling like a bit of a proto-vaporwave track, and I know it's very removed for that kind of thing, but watch, someone is gonna rip this song and slow it down like crazy, and I'm sure it's gonna sound awesome. Over the Shoulder is one of the best songs in the Ministry catalog, and I will hear no ifs, ands, or buts. This song totally rips. I love the music video where Al is being carted around a grocery store in this goofy ass outfit while kids steal a car and go on a joyride. It's totally sick. And the end tracks off this album are pretty cool too. They feel a bit more avant-garde and kind of feel creatively like they're a lead into the first Revolting Cocks album, Big Sexy Land. Okay, we're into it now. We're into the top 3. These are the big boys, and while I know not all of you are going to agree with my opinion, I still think that this is the best of the best regardless, and that these albums are all in the same realm of quality. Number 3 is 1988's The Land of Rape and Honey. This album is absolutely earth-shattering as a listen. Stigmata is one of the best opening songs of all time. That track, Into the Missing, and Deity is such a killer trio of songs that absolutely do not let up. This is really, in my mind, the first proper Ministry album, and despite how much I love the first 2 Ministry records, this is where they really found their sound, and they have so much to prove on this record. The title track, The Land of Rape and Honey, is one of the most bizarre and catchy songs I've ever heard. You Know What You Are still absolutely crushes with its cycling samples of laughter which are pulled right out of A Fistful of Dollars, and it's kind of hard for me to put my thoughts on this album into words. It's just so good. It's not perfect, but it is incredible nonetheless. I know this is where things get tense, and some people are going to really hate this, but my number 2 is 1992's Psalm 69, The Way to Succeed and The Way to Suck Eggs. This album has a pretty similar similar formula to the Land of Rape and Honey, with two of the best songs in the Ministry catalog leading the record. NWO is utterly a classic. Just One Fix is one of the heaviest songs Ministry has put out in terms of raw violence, and with lyrics written by William S. Burroughs, this is a brilliantly vile track. TV2 really brings the ultra-high BPM intensity to a head for the first time for these guys, and I just want to say that the way Al has continued to put out tracks that call back to this song on more recent releases really is a shame. While it doesn't really ruin the song for me, I can't help but think of how awful those tracks are, but this one's fantastic. And of course, you can't talk about Psalm 69 without mentioning Jesus Built My Hot Rod, a song that was written and released as a single before any other track on the album was written. A song that set the bar so high that the pressure to put out a good record compounded into this absolute classic. And with that, there's only one album that I have not brought up yet, and that, of course, is 1989's The Mind Is a Terrible Thing to Taste. I love this album. I love it so much. Thieves is one of the best tracks in the entire industrial genre, and the same thing goes for Burning Inside. The pure energy that these songs have pouring out of them is insane, and the fact that this is still early enough in Ministry's catalog means that the following tracks, while not all being the same level of energy, are all trying and succeeding at reaching into different pockets and niches of sound. This record to me really is the most well-rounded release that they have. Never Believe and Cannibal Song delve into eerie and uncanny with horror-based samples and motifs. Breathe is an incredibly catchy and dancey track that runs fluidly into So What, a rebellious anthem about degeneracy and rule bending and breaking. Test, while not a highlight for me, is a really cool blend of industrial and rap, possibly the earliest example out there. Faith Collapsing and Dream Song both hit a really similar style to Never Believe and Cannibal Song, with more of these heavily sampled beats and dreary, washed out production that is so unique to this genre. It's a great album. I don't know if everyone will agree with me that it's their best, but I'm sure that most people will understand the logic. So that's it then. That's Ministry from worst to best. Thank you all so much for watching to the end. You're really the best. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to see what you guys think. And please like the video and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. And finally, check out my Instagram and my Reverb store. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.